welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here on this lovely hot Sunday afternoon in Pomona. Thank you for coming far and wide to be here today, and we're very excited to have this wonderful show that is a amalgamation of artists from Italy and artists from the Los Angeles area that all deal with artists' books and or the inspiration of books. And we're very excited. Thank you, John, who is one of the co-curators, John David O'Brien, along with Raffaella Lupi and Stefania Severi, who obviously cannot be here because they're in Italy.
And they have a real difficult time getting over. You have to quarantine for 14 days. It's just
a very
complicated moment in history.
As we know, it's a very difficult situation now to be able to travel from one country to another. So they unfortunately couldn't be here. They wanted to be here, unfortunately could not. But John did help to coordinate the transport of a lot of the Italian works here, and we're excited to have half of the work of Italian artists meeting half of the work that is LA-based artists working with artist books, who are also here today.
And we'll talk about their work in person.
We will be talking, and we welcome you. Thank you for being here today. Nancy Monk, Susan Cerrone, and Stas Arlovsky, sorry.
Almost
I have people have difficulty with my name too, so I commiserate. But thank you, all three of you, for being here today, because it really does add nuance for the students. And we are videotaping this today in order to archive it, document it, as well as to have it available for people that aren't able to be here today. So thank you so much, John. I'm going to leave it to you.
Sure. So the exhibition that was put together by myself and my two friends and really wonderful collaborators in Rome was called La Biblioteca. And that's just Italian for the library, but if you do LA Biblioteca, then it takes the letters of Los Angeles and you make the Biblioteca, which translates literally as bookcase. So the word bookcase, which means bookstore, is a bookcase. So this is the LA Biblioteca. I was very happy to have had the suggestion from Lidia Predominato, a friend of mine who's also an artist in the show, and Raffaella Lupi, who owns the Galleria Sinopi in Rome, to do a show in Rome that was based on artist books, because that way they were transportable, people could see them in the context of a gallery that's not fundamentally a contemporary art gallery, it's more of a salon for different types of things, but it also includes fiber art and things that are related to books. After that, they said, wouldn't it be nice to have an exhibition in Los Angeles? So very happily, Michelle offered to let us do a library show in the library, the Biblioteca show, in a biblioteca, in Pomona. And we reformulated. Maybe Stefania and Raffaella took over the curatorialship of the show. Lydia stepped back, became one of the artists in the show. And then I asked a number of LA-based artists if they'd like to participate. And the only condition we asked is if there's something Italianate related to Italy in your work, if you could foreground that so there's a relationship also with the artists from Italy. So what we have is a very heterogeneous types of work. We have wonderfully different approaches, different thematics, and that is the intent of the show. It is not meant to stylistically streamline anything. It's not got a thematic chord that ties them together, except that they're all very serious artists doing really beautiful work, really interesting work. So that was how the LA Biblioteca is. That's the library. At this moment, we could assemble a different bookcase. We could put different books on it. But I think that that's what we really set out to do, and so we're very happy to be out here in the library with the wonderful exhibition design of Michelle, and I'm going to turn the talking over to the artist then. In fact, one of the artists, Nancy Monk, I'm standing right next to the work, so can we change places?
Sure.
And I don't know what you want to address. You talk about what you wish.
I have an Italian backpack. I always have it. I didn't bring it just for today, but some years back, I teach a class at PCC, Pasadena City College, and they were tearing down this building and building a new art building. And I went in one of the painting rooms, and they were throwing out all these student canvases. And one of the teachers had a project where a student had to do a different canvas every 10 minutes. So there were all these canvases with kind of just very quick paintings on them. And I took the stack, and they sat around for a couple years, and then finally I got a sander out and started sanding them down to paint over, because I do that. I paint over things, and I do tree images. And I had returned from a trip also at the same time from Italy, visiting my niece in Viterbo. And when I sanded these canvases down, I saw Italy again. It was like, wow, these canvases are Italy, the colors. And so that's how I started this series that I call Italy, a series of trees. I see them as trees. But they look like specific cities to me. And also, I had gone to school in Perugia when I was 17. My parents sent me there for the summer, a school program. And so I went back to Perugia, and this one is called Perugian tree. And so they really, it was very serendipity, this series for me. All these things kind of came together at the same time. My trip to Italy, my re-trip to Italy, and discovering, or kind of, I think a lot of artists are like that. You have a stack of something that sits there for 5 or 10 years, 20 years, and then all of a sudden one day you kind of say, oh, I know what to do with this. So.
And you kind of work in little
Yeah.
archives too, and so in some ways that's a connection with the books. You don't
Yes.
necessarily put them into a folding element, but you collect them, and sometimes you put them in clamshells. I've seen
Yes.
your work travel as a kind of a box, and that's another portfolio, another way of dealing with the idea that there's this archive within it. And can you tell us the
And
different
the
cities?
story,
And-
yeah. And I mean, there's always a narrative, yeah.
Totally.
So one is Viterbo, one is
Rome,
Rome.
Roma, Viterbo.
Roma.
This one I forget.
Oh,
This
is Viterbo, this is Perugia, and then this is,
The first one is Assisi, I believe.
oh, Assisi, sorry.
that's good, right?
The second one is Perugia.
Perugia.
The third is Viterbo. And
Okay.
the last is Roma.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Assisi is real dear to my heart.
And then
The
anecdotally, when you and I
cathedral.
first met, we talked about being in school in Perugia, because I also went to Perugia for a brief period after I was living in Naples.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, remember? That's when we first met, and we were talking
Yeah.
about this Italian language connection.
Uh-huh,
Yeah, yeah. So-
yeah.
So myself, having lived in Italy also for a
Oh,
while,
okay.
I recognize the feel of each of the cities by the architecture, the type of art, that you've chosen for each one of these that really
Uh-huh.
identify with that particular city. Italy is such a diverse place. Every city has its own thing, its own look, its own, usually its own cathedral, right? And that sort of dictates a lot of that architecture and the design of that city and how it's laid out and so on, and what
Mhm.
influences it. Often gives it its character and personality. So I'm curious. It seems that that's what has affected each of the different ones.
Well, I kind of named them after. Like this one really reminded me of the sky in the Giotto paintings.
Right.
Before I was doing the work is very textural for me. I don't normally do that much texture. And so it really kind of reminded me of those the old paintings.
Well, and something in what you did
and
is
the
really
gold.
interesting because, like the Rome one, the last one there at the bottom,
Uh-huh.
is so much reminds me of like the columns of the temples, the Roman architecture, this sort of idea of the rectangle, the basilica.
And
then,
floor plan.
The floor plan. If you
Yeah.
look at it aerially, it has
Yeah.
that feeling, right? Of the, of the aerial floor plan of a Roman or even Greek temple, which would have been very influential on the Roman architecture.
Yeah, and that's all. I work very intuitively.
I think that it's very, very interesting that it's intuitive, but yet it's so spot on.
Yeah, so I don't plan anything, so that's all just kind of happens.
That's wonderful. Do you
Yeah,
have
so-
more than these four?
I do, I have a whole series. Uh-huh.
Wow, I'd love to see the rest.
Yeah.
So the other thing
Yeah.
about Italy that you're talking about just underscored, Italy was unified as a country only in the late 1800s.
Right.
And before that, they were city-states. So there really is quite a difference. There even was a difference at one point in language. The dialects still exist, so you can have dialects that move from city to city if you live in a certain part of the north, south, or center. But it really gives that, so as artists, oftentimes people when they do travel to Italy, they're very shall we say, intuitively drawn to these different city-states and the things that were in there and how they were like maybe Baroque or maybe they were neoclassical or maybe they were Renaissance. And so those are the things that as artists we bring back. And even if we don't want to sit there and identify specifically the Baroque of this one or the classical of this one or the Renaissance of this one, that's what ends up coming through the synonymous with, you could say Mark Twain, and most Americans will have an idea of what's going on. But nobody in this country really knows Gianni Rodari. So he was telling me that he had this connection that he really felt strongly of, and that was all I wanted to say. Just to bring that up.
Yeah, I think the connection to this Italian children's book author, Rodari, for me was really just kind of a very serendipitous kind of connection, because he did a lot of the Soviets loved his work, and there were a lot of Soviet era children's books that were illustrated by Soviet illustrators of his writings, of his books. And one of his famous books called Gelsomino in the Country of Liars is a book that has not been translated into English. And I'm desperately trying to figure out how to do that. But it's one of my old Russian children's books. I was born in Moldova, which is a former Soviet republic, and I have a stack of these books that have informed a lot of my paintings and drawings, and in the last 10 years, these animations that I've been doing. And so at first, it had really very little to do with Rodari in particular. It just happened to be that some of those books, one book in particular that I kept going back to as a point of reference for my work, that I started to look into the author, I started to look into the narrative. Most of the time, the imagery and the quality of the making of the book, the paper, the inexpensive printing techniques that were used, the color, all those things were really what drew me initially to using them as a reference. And then it's just been really in the last 10 years that the narrative itself has been sort of something that I was looking at. Oddly enough, that particular book is about a boy who has this crazy loud voice that kind of every time he speaks it shatters things, but he ends up in this world, this kind of a backwards world where yes is no, right side up is upside down, everything's backwards. And it's ruled by this blonde-haired king who then gets exposed, and his blonde wig is fake. And anyway, it had curiously lined up with Trump in an interesting way. It was almost like a perfect representation of what was happening in the country, of where literally these, lies were being spewed and as truth. So it was just this kind of amazing thing of seeing this book from, the 60s, post-Cold War, where I guess the history of the writing was about, had come from a very specific time and place, and it was, again, fresh. So that was compelling. So the little character in this animation and this running character in these paintings it's a kind of very insignificant little moment in one of the illustrations in the book of a running man. And so the man ran into my paintings and drawings and animations, and it's a motif that I've been kind of mucking around with for a while. The running man is a motif that's gone throughout art history, right? I mean, think of Rodin, right? You can think of Giacometti. I mean, it's all over.
Balla, the famous
Giacomo Balla, right? It's rampant throughout European art history, and in contemporary art too, right? I mean, there's Pettibone's running man. There's why am I blanking on the incredible new media artist that was Bay Area that had just passed away from ALS.
I'm not sure who that is.
I'm totally blanking. But he was one of the early kind of media artists. I'll think of his name. Anyway, I think there's lots of interesting connections that I think are just a function of the iconography of a running figure. But for me, it's also about migration, right? Kind of a personal story of kind of moving and running. So there's lots of layers, and so it was obvious that he needed to move. So he had to be static. He may have been static in the paintings, but then he needed to be actually physically running. So in this case, I've been working in a series of projections. That these are hand-drawn stop-motion animations, old school, kind of late 19th century technology. I make a mark, take a frame, make a mark, take a frame, 24 drawings, make 1 second of footage. Super slow, super old school. The flicker is just the changing light. In my studio, there's no filter. There's no compensation for light. It's just the camera pointed at me drawing and moving collage around. And the projections in this new body of work have always been projected onto found objects. And in this case, this little crate, these crates have kind of become a perfect little container.
Nice little theater, isn't it?
Nice little theater, yeah.
And then, like with Nancy, Stoss's work with archiving from a book doesn't necessarily turn itself back into a book, but it has this layered. There are many other paintings, many other drawings, other projections, and this is just a sampler. So when Stefania and Rafael and I talked about it, we decided we're not going to make it specifically that you have to make an artist book. The artist book expands to being an archive, and then its final manifestation can have more varied ways of appearing than just that of being another kind of a book. But we do also have Susan's work, which is...
I have a question.
Oh,
Sorry, before you move on. Do you have an estimate, just for the students here, because they work in stop motion, right? How many of you guys have done some stop motion work as part of your classes? Give me an estimate. Do you know, like, for the full loop of footage, approximately how many frames or how many images are there to make?
We could do the math. It's basically maybe a little over like 2.5 minutes or so.
Uh-huh.
And so 24 frames per second.
Right.
So how many seconds?
24 times 160.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a substantial amount.
Yeah.
Hundreds, right?
Thousands, yeah.
Thousands,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And then weirdly enough, when I was first in Urbino, because they saw my work mostly when I was doing things as a high schooler, as cartoons, they wanted me to go into animation. And it was single cell animation.
Yes.
And I went to this building, and I wanted to do printmaking. Went to this building, I was working there for about maybe 2 weeks, and I finally told them, I'm going to become suicidal.
Yeah.
I need to get someplace faster.
Yeah.
So they moved me to printmaking, which wasn't that much faster, but
Yeah.
it wasn't single cell.
Yeah,
At
yeah.
least the state from
Yeah.
state changed.
Yeah.
But,
And just to clarify, it's not single cell. So what it is it's one drawing that's modified.
yeah, in our case, we were drawing every
were
single
doing
cell
single
with
cell.
24 per second.
Yes.
So, and the films were generally supposed to be like 3 minutes long, so it's just,
Right.
each
Yeah.
one, you have like
Yeah.
literally hundreds of
But it has the Luminari Brothers feeling, like, because of how that flickering that you're talking about,
Yes.
that sort of change of light that
Yeah.
isn't controlled.
Yeah.
It does give it this like very old timey feel, which I just love. I
Yeah.
think it's really great. It adds so much character to this. Because if it was super clean, I think it would be completely a whole different thing.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, for me, like, the idea of these images living on a monitor
Mhm.
don't make sense. Like,
Right.
projected light to me is the same thing as charcoal or paint.
Right.
I mean, projected light is material, so the file might be digital.
I mean, the original thing is tactile and analog, but it
Mhm.
gets translated into digital file, but then it gets output as projected light. So it starts as material, and then it ends, as material.
As
so
light.
yeah, as light. So I
Yeah.
think it's very old fashioned.
Yeah.
It's
But I like that you also accompanying it with the traditional work where you do see the character there, sort of hidden in
Mhm.
these little scenarios. It's very sweet.
Thank you.
And are you looking at pursuing to see if this book can be translated in English and sold in the U.S.? I mean, that sounds like a
It's a really interesting
idea.
idea. I really don't know why this particular book. It was made into a film.
Oh.
So there's a
There's
film.
In English?
there's a Rodati Foundation,
Yeah.
which you probably have to
Yeah.
ask. And
Yeah.
there's a company, a group
Yeah.
of publishers out
Yeah.
of Brooklyn called Archipelago,
Yeah.
who are specialized in doing translations of the highest quality.
Yeah.
But I need to imagine that probably somewhere along the line something stopped that mechanism from
Yeah.
happening, because he's internationally famous.
That's right.
As you
But
said.
is
Yeah.
the book this is from illustrations from the book?
The illustrations were done by a Russian artist,
Uh-huh.
so they kind of look like Russian suprematism meets folk, right? Like
Okay.
the aesthetics are, it's like Malevich meets like I don't know, traditional folk.
Chagall.
Yeah, or maybe even Chagall. Yeah, it kind of has maybe that's exactly right, like a very Chagall-esque. But I think, Chagall maybe is a bit more European, right? When you look at it in terms of like the Cubist influence, I think these feel like the geometry of that really kind of austere moment in Russian art was really part of it, but it's also for kids, right? So there's this playful, really interesting aesthetic to it. So the illustrations are Russians, but the narrative is by the Italian.
And Rodati was very generous in letting other people work with his
Yeah.
work. He wasn't fixated on only doing the ones that he did or that he
Right.
had the control over. So that his work got a huge diffusion.
Yeah.
And as a result, it got to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
In keeping with the idea of using an artwork as a kind of part of a iceberg where something sticks out above the water but below water is a lot more, I've been working with books and with archiving and archives for a very long time. Some of them include things like documenting specific spaces. So in this particular series, of which this is just one, I was doing photographs of the piles of books, of the piles of notes, of the piles of things that I keep. And because I'm also a sculptor, I tend to want to move them around as a mass, understanding them as a kind of a thing. And the archive just ended up being useful to have in conjunction with an artist book show, because it's sort of like the depository of those resources that are eventually going to make itself into something else. Now, if it makes it into a book, maybe that'd be good. If it makes itself into a sculpture, that'd be good. And so these series here, which morph together two words, biblioteca and book ledge, it's about the notion that there's this area that is being excavated, being collected. It's like a quarry. And then I overlaid on it a drawing in gray and white that's actually from Hercules Sager's print. It's a print about books. So there's a printmaker that made these drawings of books, which is beautiful line work. And then I put it on this sort of almost, I would call it iconic background, because I wanted to be a kind of exalting the moment of this storing and quarrying and excavating. But it's not yet, those have not been excavated. So that's just one of the ways. And it was also an attempt to give sort of a curatorial read on what it is that I'm interested in general with artists. I'm always looking at artists in their studio more than in the galleries, because in the studio there's everything. There's all the work, there's all the stuff, there's the stuff that they're going to have you ignore. And when it gets to a gallery or to an exhibition moment, it's usually been cleaned up. And I actually am interested in the rough edges that you could see in a studio practice. So that was my portrait as book collector, detritus amasser, large accumulator of stuff that then eventually either gets used or disposed of. And it was my distinct pleasure to work with all of these artists and have a chance to work with the people here, Cal Poly Pomona's Huntley Gallery. So that is my brief and rather complicated expression of self. I'm encumbered by being me. I would be easier if I could talk about somebody else's work. It's much quicker.
Well, it gave me a chance, because like, where do I start? I mean,
Well, you could tell them what we started
I mean,
as.
as far as my trajectory as making or using books has always been kind of an excavation into a pre-existing book. So that starts me looking at art history and things that kind of have a conversation. So as this project kind of developed, it became more about me making a new book instead of using a book and just taking away things more sculpturally and leaving something behind. So play on the ideas of appropriation, because that was the original idea of when you appropriate from a different culture, what happens to it and how it gets shared, and is it a good thing, to assimilation. So using three distinct books, one Roman art, and these are all historical Roman, very few contemporary, and these are all a series of small identical books. So I took these original books and cut away things like you see here, and took each page from, like one page from each book, and created and I'm just going to go ahead and touch my work here, made a three-dimensional panel. So here would be something that was from the African book, from the Italian book, and from an American book, which of course astounding how the American art history book was all about buildings. I mean, you got the Guggenheim, the Empire State, so much more so than sculpture from Africa, sculpture and painting from Italy. So I scanned the pages and recut these three, or this little triptych, to bring the three together as one, because if you fold them, this piece of art is a very dynamic thing. You can get all kinds of new unique designs and patterns, and it can be displayed different ways. So again, I'm trying to kind of assimilate different cultures and different time frames, and make something that has kind of it's interesting to look at, the shadows. It was nice to make a book, to actually take something, manipulate it in Photoshop, print it out, recut it, and now it's mine to some degree. Only I definitely respect all of the art that went before me. The collages, as the project progressed, I told John, I'm inspired by doing watercolors based on these cutouts, but they're kind of different. And he goes, go for it. He just said, whatever you want. So I started making, and I would say I probably have about 50 to 100 small watercolors. There's tons more work associated with this small sampling. The negative spaces that were cut out, I started collaging on top of the watercolors, making just pretty graphics. Just fun, just in my studio, making interesting looking things without being too bogged down. And a final panel where I actually took some of the original cut book pages and again layered them up top. So there's kind of this progression of how a project that, given a year in isolation, went from a very simple, I'm just going to cut and fold pages, to really kind of a body of work that now has, for me, potential to, there's all places to explore. So,
Yeah, and just to be clear, the original project was to have the books remain just that book and separate from
yeah,
each other.
these are, from
Like
this
those.
collage here, that's the original book pages collaged back on. So
But when you made this new project, you actually printed willfully a page from each of the three books
Right.
put together.
if I took an individual page here, like page 91, which is what that very front one is, I put that next to page 40 from each book, and those were already cut out, scanned into Photoshop, laid out in a 3-panel grid, and then recut. So I maintained some of the original structure of the first book, meaning that if you cut the positive image from the front, you get kind of a negative, you get text perhaps. You get whatever was on the original books back. Is that integrity is maintained. So that's kind of the homage to the original book, saying there's still remnants of how the first book communicated its message and how I've kind of abstracted it down. And that was actually a big part of my first idea. Was I was so intrigued by these bright colors and things being used to communicate art through a book format. And to me, it's like you can't really talk about art unless you've seen it. But your only starting point all the time is a book to say, here's a picture of the Mona Lisa, go out and see it. Well, they're using everything they can to get you to heighten the experience that you would normally get if you were to see the art in person. So I was drifting on the idea of how things are communicated and what kinds of things are communicated. So it's complicated,
Well,
but there's layers again.
Once again, if you're looking at artists' books as a system of creating an archive and then looking and having the artists talk about their process, then you discover that actually it's an opening to a much larger world. It's just a small aperture. What I've always loved about artists' books is that they're usually done by people who do many other things. There's some people just do artists' books, but people actually end up generating a practice, and in that practice, there is a extended set of layers that add up to this one book or that one chapter. But then it also, going behind it, you can see how it opens up other vistas on what you might want to accomplish as an artist in other ways, in other shapes, other forms. So, Dante Alighieri is one of the canonical writers in Italy. His very important writing was called Heaven, Hell, and Purgatory. So Paradiso, Inferno, e Purgatorio. And it is a 3-volume tome that was written when the Renaissance was really starting to come about in Florence, before the Renaissance he wrote actually. And they're considered extraordinarily important texts. In fact, all Italians, when you go to school, you will read Dante Alighieri without any problem whatsoever. It's part of your basic education.
You've probably heard of Dante's Inferno.
Yeah.
That's who we're talking about.
Although generally speaking, they pick some from the Paradiso and a little bit from the Inferno. But it's-
Paradiso is paradise, heaven.
Yeah, Paradiso,
Okay.
yeah.
Inferno is hell.
Yeah.
And then purgatory.
So not only was Fiorentino his dialect from Florence, the language that was becoming the Italian generalized language, because Italy spoke dialects for many, many, many years. It still does. It was also a literary style that was built by him. And there are certain phrases that you'll hear on the start of our walk, at the start of the darkness. They come directly from his stories. So it's one of those things that almost all Italians, if you quote something from Dante in Italian, they're like, oh, why are you saying that? They all know it. So
It's like they're Shakespeare.
yes, it's very
To an
much like
extent.
Shakespeare for the English language, absolutely. And I'm sure it's a bit
For the Italian.
like Cervantes for Spanish, because Don Quixote is really important. Most people who read it, who read Spanish. There's lots of different. They're called canonical figures. They created a moment that crystallized part of a culture, so they're used that way. So that was what she wanted to concentrate here on this with this book. And you can see that, for example, this one is not done as experimental a technique as that one. That's the other thing. Artists will sometimes go back and forth between things that are more able to be produced in small quantities, but more than one, or they'll do something that's entirely unique. So they go from limited editions or sets that are only maybe 4 or 5 to things like Vittorio Fava's book. These are one of a kind. He uses found materials. He makes, these aren't even called in Italian artist books. They're called libro oggetto, art book objects. Book objects was a word that was couched by a really important artist who did a lot of writing and making, Medela Bentivoglio, who was a friend of mine for as long as she lived. She's no longer with us. She died when she was 91 a couple of years ago. But she said, these aren't books, these are book objects. Because the idea is to accentuate the physicality of these things. So Vittorio takes things that exist, papers, shells, stones, little diadems, and
Grab some gloves and then you can open it.
basically goes through and makes these. And they're also quite obviously not meant to last forever. These materials are not planned to exist forever. He documents things, but it's not his plan that these things will live in perpetuity. Some artists, I know Vittorio's work generally.
All right, and there you go. And so it's like a book inside.
So
of a
not
book.
uncommonly, Vittorio has
It's an
things
object
with
inside
things
of an
within things.
object.
Now I'm not going to pry this out, or maybe I,
It does come out,
Yeah.
but if you want, there we go.
yeah.
Don't rip it. There we go.
So it's got a book within a book. This is an actually small printed book. And he's laminated onto the front and the back elements that come probably from one of his trips to Israel, or possibly one of his trips to Egypt.
And this has to do, this is called the Book of Religions, right?
Mhm, yes.
Four religions.
For religion.
So, do you know what 4 religions those might be?
The ones that typically he would be concentrating on
I
would
mean,
be
obviously Christianity.
Christianity,
Uh-huh.
Judaism, Islam, and probably Buddhism.
Okay.
Those would be the 4.
That's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
is
I
the-
don't think he has any Hindu, but
Yeah, it said 4 religions. so
that's what the
why.
title is here.
Okay.
Once again, this is, one of the things I also like about book artists' books, is that they generally title them, so you're not completely in the dark as to what they're thinking about.
Right.
And then they have little statements which they all give for
Yeah.
us to point us in one direction or another.
The idea of seeing Carly Parker's pieces that deal with Italian landscape
There are photographs from actually villas in Sicilia, I believe.
and one is from a villa. It's like the garden of Ravello, and then the other one is the seascape of, I guess, the Amalfi Coast, I believe,
Yes.
if I remember correctly. And then they're combined with sort of these glass, broken glass images. And then I always notice that circular. If you guys look up close, you can see that circular. I always, I talk to the students about the Oculus
Right.
in Rome,
Uh-huh.
and I don't know if that is a direct reference, but I can't help but think that. And then the interesting thing is, I think if you look at this show, I think you could see the Oculus 3 different times in 3 different artists' work.
So different.
Going back to Carly Parker's pieces, though, over here, one thing I read in her artist statement was the concept that art can be a copy of a copy of a copy. And that to me is sort of, when I read that, I thought, there's a connection to the idea of publishing, republishing something and copying it over. How that still is art. I mean, we've already established that in our history.
Totally.
That it a copy of a copy of a copy can still be art. And so I found that to be a connecting factor. Thank you everybody for being here today. I appreciate it very much for all of you coming out from near and far. Thank you so much for making that journey. It's been a real pleasure to do this show, and of course it's very close to my heart for my experience living in Italy as well as being Italian
Michelle
myself.
almost became a permanent resident in Venice.
Yeah, perhaps.
Which is easy to understand if you've ever been to Venice. It's very captivating.
Right. So, anyway, I also want to thank my family for coming tonight. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And for all my students and for their hard work helping me put this show together. Without them, there would be no show. So,
Thank you for coming out.
yeah, we're editing the video of the event. And it's going to be 5 hours. So, and I can't believe, here, this is like, no, this is pretty much permanent. But the thing is it is removable, so it's not permanent. Yeah. And there's squares, you can buy them in like 1-inch squares.
So you want me to put them on?
Raffaella said, well, why don't you put together something for my gallery? And we did the first show over there in Sinopia. And they said, oh, it'd be really cool to do a show here. So it's been an effort that's been shared by myself, by Stefania, Lydia, and also Raffaella. But yeah, making art's a lot of work stuff, but it's a great thing to be doing. I mean, it keeps me off the streets. I'm not getting back into crime again. I've avoided all sorts of addiction this way. Probably better, don't you think?
No, it's on campus. It has to be stopped. Oh, my students are still working on editing. As soon as, like this week, they were going back to that one. But yeah, we're editing the video of the event. And it's going to be 5 hours. So, yeah, it was 4.5 hours. And it was artists directors. Artists were talking about their work, and they all want every